You are listening to the Down the Wormhole podcast, exploring the strange and fascinating relationship between science and religion. This week, our hosts are
Kendra Holtmore, Assistant Professor of Religion at Bethany College, and my most recent ailment was a concussion from a snowboarding fall.
Zach Jackson, UCC pastor in Reading, Pennsylvania, and my most recent ailment was COVID.
Rachel Jackson, Rabbi at Agudis Israel Congregation, Hendersonville, North Carolina. My most recent ailment is pretty bland but irritating nonetheless. It was just a headache, but it was one of those headaches that I couldn't get rid of, and a headache for no reason, and I felt like, oh my god, I'm just old, I now just get headaches.
Ian Benz, Associate Professor of Elementary Science Education at UNC Charlotte, and my most recent ailment is arthritis in my right hand, where this part is where the thumb comes down and connects to the wrist. It is definitely confirmed, no longer early onset arthritis. So, yeah, that was fun.
Why did you ask for this question, Ian?
For two reasons. One, because we just passed your birthday, Rachel. So it's celebration of your birthday.
You're old. Everything hurts. Yeah. Just adding the parenthetical aside, Everybody Hurts from REM is an amazing song from 1992. And it's younger than I am.
And Kendra should know. Yeah, I know that was out before. No. When were you born again, Kendra? 1991?
91.
Ah, see, so
91.
It's not that old.
Nothing hurt then.
Yeah.
I was fresh. Fresh and vibrant.
The second reason that we're asking these questions because we're starting our new miniseries, or our next miniseries on healing. So for today, I'm going to give just a very quick crash course in kind of the history of healing from a science perspective. And I will let our listeners know that, my background in understanding this is definitely more in the Western science. So please, if anyone hears this and says, hey, you've left out some cultures, historical cultures, that I do apologize for that. But as I said, this is going to be very brief. So we could do several episodes just on the history of medicine. But so anyway, so I kind of wanted to just give some general interesting things that have occurred over time, and then I wanted us to be able to get into a conversation about like medical treatments for different ailments as well. But some of our understanding of the history of medicine goes all the way back to prehistoric times, and this is where I think it will come into play throughout our series as well, of how different cultures used to attribute different types of magic or religion to ailments. Maybe it was something to do with evil spirits or something like that. But supernatural origin versus more of a natural origin of a reason for different ailments. But one of the things that we know from the discovery of different prehistoric skulls is that they would actually drill a hole into the skull of the victim because they believed that the speculation is, and then we actually see this occurred in more recent human history, that it would release the disease. And so that was one thing.
You mean patient?
Did I say victim?
You did say victim.
Yeah,
I didn't even catch that.
we're going to keep that in because, if
you're showing your hand here.
If you are going to drill during prehistoric times and you're going to knock a hole into the person's skull, they may end up being the victim. Right. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there you go. And then now we're going to jump ahead to ancient Egypt when we start actually seeing some evidence of written evidence of different types of treatments and medicine. One example is from what was called the Smith Papyrus, written in 1600 BCE, right around there. But it was actually, we believe it was a copy of a text from much earlier, so roughly 3000 BCE. But in that particular papyrus that's now, I think, in New York, it contained 48 case studies. There was no theory for anything, but it was an observation and kind of a recording of what it is that they knew. So the case studies were all written the same way. You had the title, the examination, so what they were observing, and then the diagnosis, and then the treatment, and then they would have a glossary for terms. But again, there would still be speculation about, well, what role do evil forces or spirits play in the cause of diseases? And then we're going to jump ahead more to ancient Greece. And this is where many people may have heard of Hippocrates of Kos, circa BCE or 420 BCE. He was one of the first people who kind of focused on natural explanations, trying to move away from supernatural explanations. And he was one of the people who came up with the idea of the four humors, which those are blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And if you were healthy, that means the four humors were in balance. If you were not healthy, that means something was off. One of the humors was off. And so this is where we start getting the idea of bloodletting. So, for example, if someone had a fever, it was due to an abundance of blood. And so they would do bloodletting as a way to cure the fever. But still at this time, and again, I'm skipping over a lot of people, they learned different things with anatomy, but they were only allowed to dissect animals because at the time it was illegal to dissect humans.
At which time?
Still 420 BCE, so this is still the BCE era, ancient really? Greece.
That sounds more like a Christian hang-up than a Greek hang-up.
Well, and actually too, I'm trying to prepare for today's episode. I did see in some of the more ancient Eastern cultures of like Hinduism, and from the early stages of that they were also not allowed to cut into the human body and dissect human bodies either. So this is not just in that area. But yeah, you're right, because Zach, as you just said, that we see that all the way up into the 1500s that they weren't supposed to be dissecting humans in Europe, for example. But they did not necessarily figure out the reason or the causes of the different parts of the body that they were removing from the body. So when it came to anatomy.
Who, the Egyptians?
From what I understand. Or am I off on that? And which if I am, that's fine.
It depends. The Ebers papyrus. And again, all these papyri, papiria, I don't know if the plural is.
Many papyrus?
The papyruses. They are named after the hippopotami. Yes, sorry. They're all
named after the discoverer.
They're all named. No, not the discoverer. They're named after the white guys who bought it at auction and then brought it back to their country. So, all of Egyptian treasures are in Europe or America somewhere instead of where they belong. But anyway.
Yeah, the Smith papyrus probably wasn't named for a guy named Smith all the way back then.
Right, no, Pharaoh Smith. No, that's not really an Egyptian name. But the Ebers papyrus was in 1550 BCE, and it had a really detailed explanation of the heart and the entire circulatory system. It was a bit wrong in some of the ways in that they thought that the heart pumped all fluids, so that includes urine and semen as well as blood. But they understood the purpose of the blood going through the muscles and the veins and the arteries and all of that. They actually also had some psychiatric conditions that were tied up in conditions of the heart. They mentioned like dementia and depression, which were problems of the heart, because they would dissect people after they died and look at the quality of their ventricles and all of that. So they didn't know what the brain was. They thought that was garbage, but the heart was the center of it all.
Thank you for correcting me, Zach. I forgot about that papyrus. Papyrus? Yes, go ahead, Rachel.
Papyrus.
Hippopotamus.
I was just going to add that because things are so ancient, we tend to forget that we say Egyptian. We're looking at thousands and thousands of years when we say ancient Egypt. So 1500 BCE is kind of the middle late kingdom, right? These are the new kingdoms, right? These are not the ones that built those giant pyramids. Right? That's 1,000 years earlier that they did that. So I think when we talk about that, we should do a little bit of justice and say, hey, it would sort of be like saying, hey, all Englanders. For all time, right? Well, that's just been 2,000 years. Like it's at some point. So just to add to that piece, and same thing with the Greek piece, right? Ancient Greek has been around for a very long time. So that's it.
No,
just a little bit of history, not the.
Speaking of the history piece too, in the 1200s or so BCE, there was this mysterious Bronze Age collapse in which these massive societies, the ancient Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, all the the Hittites, they just collapsed. And we're not entirely sure why. Possibly these sea peoples, possibly climate change, possibly a million other things. Aliens, if you watch the History Channel. But all of these amazing societies, the Minoans, another one, they all just disappeared. And so you see later Greek society and later Egyptian society then trying to make sense of the fact that there are these ancient ruins that are massive, and they just assume that ancient heroes built them, which is where a lot of the mythology comes from. But so like this sort of understanding of anatomy and health was probably somewhat lost in going into the period that now you're talking about, where people aren't allowed to dissect. So we see them now because we found the papyri, but they may not have had them as well.
Well, so Zach, you mentioned, of that, massive loss of civilization around that time frame, and you mentioned, seafaring people too. I mean, are you talking about Atlantis there, buddy? I mean, is that?
I am, actually.
Yeah.
The Minoans were probably the source of the Atlantean myth as far as...
Because wasn't Plato one of the first ones to talk about it? Plato was the first one to write about that. We have documentation.
It's an Egyptian story that Plato heard and wrote about, that there's this island nation that was super advanced in technology and in society, and then they angered Poseidon, right? And then they were wiped out by the sea for their iniquities. And so that lines up really nicely with the Minoan people who were on Crete, who at the time, I mean, we're talking 1500 BCE, further back, had like 3-story buildings with hot and cold running water and indoor plumbing. They had amazing art and architecture. They were doing things that thousands of years later people hadn't discovered. And then they were hit by this massive tsunami after the what's that place in Greece that everyone goes on vacation with the beautiful blue waters? Santorini.
Yeah.
The volcano there exploded.
Oh, that's right.
And caused dust. It caused tsunamis and basically wiped out their society. And then the Mycenaeans conquered them, and then the Bronze Age collapsed. So we forgot all about them for thousands of years. But they were probably the inspiration of Atlantis. It's not aliens. Sorry. It's probably just Minoans.
That's a bummer.
Yeah, well, this has been Zach Ruins Mythology for you.
Ooh, a new segment. I love that.
Yeah, exactly. You could just splice this out and move it to the end. So let's get back to, because I think while we're doing this too, it's interesting. While I am going to be focusing mostly on how we start to see more of a focus on natural phenomena, natural explanations, and a scientific approach to medicine, that you still do see, like Hippocrates being one of the individuals, again, from 420 BCE, trying to move away from supernatural, that even with the work of Hippocrates, that it did not drive out like the rivals, along the more traditional forms of healing up to that point, the traditional forms of healing, belief and practice, that those still existed. So it's not like when his work and his contemporaries, and actually there's speculation that Hippocrates was multiple people. It was not one. And so just because of that, though, it did not drive out the more traditional ways of belief and practice, as I was saying. So then I'm going to jump ahead roughly 500 years to Rome and Galen. So Galen was a individuals from 129 to circa 200 CE. And he really started getting into this notion of we need to rely on the world of our senses. But he still accepted the idea of the 4 humors that was originally proposed by Hippocrates. He recognized that arteries contain blood and not merely air. He also showed how the heart sets blood in motion. But he did not have an idea about the whole notion of circulation, blood circulation. But he did start figuring out that the heart did move things at least a little bit. We definitely see evidence of controlled experimentation with Galen. He focused some on anatomy, but again, at the time frame, dissection of humans was illegal. And so his work was focusing on animals, dissection of animals. And it's his work that actually kind of stayed, when you think about Western culture and Western medicine, kind of was the prevailing view of how things were done until the 1500s. Which actually, the reason why I remember that so much is with that part is because his work was occurring right around the time of Ptolemy, when you talk about astronomy. And that stayed around for roughly the same amount of time till, Copernicus and his work. So it was kind of all those things started happening right around the same time. So now, again, my apologies for leaving out multiple cultures, that I want to jump ahead again now to medieval and Renaissance Europe. And so, as I said, Galen's views kind of held strong until roughly the 1500s. And this is when we see Andreas Vesalius emerge. And yes, there were others before him, but he was one of the first ones to really get into dissection of humans. I think he was a person who had students who were grave robbers because it was still illegal at the time, but he realized that for anatomy, we needed a better understanding of the human body. So his students would become grave robbers and steal the bodies, and then they would do special dissections, for like a show. I mean, there were many, many people watching, but they would have lookouts to make sure that they weren't doing anything, that they wouldn't get caught.
Do you put them back?
I don't know that part.
After you're done?
I don't know.
I would hope so.
Yeah, you'd think so.
I would think so. Not just hope so, but I would think so.
Yeah.
And apparently he was a very skilled dissector, and he felt like, they had to move away from Galen and his views. And don't forget, I said, we're jumping time. This was 1400 years later. So Galen's views held strong for a long time. But he did a lot of dissection of humans, and his scientific observations and methods with these, Vesalius showed that Galen can no longer be regarded as the final authority. And so that's when we start to see, and again, this is also aligning with the time of the Renaissance, that's when we start seeing movement away from more ancient understandings when it comes to science, to medicine, for example. He believed in the importance of empirical knowledge, independent observation, and experimentation. So Vesalius was really into those types of things. I don't know if he was ever caught. I have to look into that one. Yeah.
Well, now he is.
Well, yeah.
You blew his cover, man.
Sorry, everybody. But what's interesting is even when that was occurring, we were also still seeing some people who were holding on to the idea that, while experimentation is important, that we still need to, Paracelsus was one of them. I think I'm saying that correct. He presents the idea that humans are the ultimate ends to God's creation. So the ultimate form. He held on to something called a chemical philosophy, which is a Christian philosophy, but it was not very widely accepted at the time because, as I've already said, this was the time of the Renaissance. They were trying to move away from those types of explanations. And so he was still around, but he was trying to blend the two between experimentation, but also to holding to the importance of God and humans kind of being the ultimate form. And then the next person I want to talk about before we start really going into different types of ailments stuff, just because of, as I said, the history, is William Harvey. He was 1578 to 1657. So he advanced medicine even further because of careful observation and experimentation. He really focused on collecting more evidence. And this is when we really start to see what we now think of as experimentation. So, controlled experimentation, manipulating nature so he can see something that normally would not be seen. He came up with the theory of the circulation of blood. So we started trying to have a better understanding of how blood circulated throughout the body. And again, he still was someone who did believe in the impact of a designer, but he really focused on the more natural explanations.
It's interesting that you say that he discovered the circulation of the blood. And we just said that 3,000 years earlier, the Egyptians knew about the circulation.
Oh, you're
of
right.
The blood.
Yeah. Yeah.
And plumbing. Plumbing, our own and in the world.
But it is fascinating. The historical texts still hold as like William Harvey is one of the people who really did that.
Well, God forbid they credit an African for discovering something.
And so just because of, because I really want us to get into conversations around like different types of treatments we see throughout history for different ailments. This was the time of the Renaissance. When you start moving past that, I mean, as we see and we've discussed throughout on this show in the past about the history of science and how scientific advancements just took off during this time frame, an incredibly fast rate. And it was the same for medical advancements too. And so we continue to see lots of different changes over time to the point where we are today. But what I really want to focus on, unless someone wants to talk more about other history, is getting into these treatments that we see throughout history. if we can.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
You're chomping at the bit over there. You want to talk about some treatments, huh?
So, because one of them I have, like asthma. So, asthma used to be treated. It was treated by smoking.
Oh,
Yes.
smoking what?
A pipe of tobacco or cigar has the power of relieving a fit of asthma, especially in those not accustomed to it, which I thought was
That
really
is amazing.
Not accustomed to tobacco?
Yes. That was the argument being presented.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Huh.
There's a
When-ish was
I think
this?
that was more like the 1800s.
Oh, recent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, counterpoint. No.
It does not.
Don't smoke
Yes.
if you have asthma.
So please understand that these are old, not accurate. There's another thing with the whole idea of smoking. For your health. This is back in the late 19th, early 20th century. I found a site that talks about these different types of treatments out there. Smoking for your health, asthma cigarettes.
Ooh.
Yeah. So, and this was an advertisement, not recommended for children under 6. That was nice. But they were actually called asthma cigarettes, and they effectively treat asthma, hay fever, foul breath, all diseases of the throat, head colds, canker sores, bronchial irritations. So, yeah, so that was a good thing.
Well, so when you're talking 19th and 20th century, and these are like some crazy, wacky solutions for things, like when they would give cocaine to children for their cough and all of that. That's not entirely like saying that the ancient Romans used electric eels to cure hemorrhoids. Like,
I know.
Which is real. Well, when we're in the 19th and 20th centuries, a lot of these are the companies understood the awful things that their products did to people, but they made
Marketing.
false advertisements to sell these addictive things to people. The Bayer Corporation knew all about the addictive qualities of cocaine and still pushed it as a simple pain reliever because they could get people addicted to it. And like those sorts of predatory capitalism has existed for the past couple hundred years with pharmaceuticals, and we are paying that price now with the opioid epidemic. So when the smoking industry in the 1800s, they didn't understand that it gave cancer, obviously, but
they knew it wasn't good.
Yeah, no, those
It's not.
advertisements are intentionally misleading because there was no oversight.
Well, and earlier I referred to bloodletting, and was talking about ancient Greece, and 400 BCE. Bloodletting did not just end then. Bloodletting was something that was continued for a very long time, for centuries.
And I believe, and I have not fact checked this, so if someone else has, please correct me or corroborate, whichever it might be. My son and I were doing stuff about presidents, and a little factoid that I heard was that George Washington got a fever, just like you were saying, Ian. And at that time, it's George Washington, early 19th century, and he got a fever. And so they decided to do bloodletting.
Mm-hmm.
And they did bloodletting twice on him, so much so that he died.
Wow. That's
No,
not
again,
really good.
I have not double checked that fact, but I also haven't seen anything to contradict it. So, take that with a grain of salt as it may. But it was all the way up until George Washington is when they were really still using this as a technique to cure people from things like fevers, which are very, very dangerous. But unless you have something to just take down the fever, you're either going to live it or you're not.
Yeah. The Constitution Center, constitutioncenter.org, says that process of bloodletting probably let about 40% of his blood supply.
Right.
So you can't really make it through a sickness with 40% of your blood supply.
Right. So think about when you donate blood. Do the three of you donate blood on a regular
I
or
can't
at all
anymore
ever?
because I grew up in Europe.
Can't.
Nope.
Right.
Haven't. Yeah.
Mad cow disease, just in case people don't know.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Zach, do you ever?
No.
Okay.
I don't.
I
mostly have issues with needles. So
yeah, exactly.
They told me not to.
Yeah, don't do that. Better for everybody that you don't go into the hospital for donating blood.
Our last blood drive was canceled, I think, because of a COVID-related thing. But I would like to, but I haven't.
Yeah. It's one of those like really simple, really useful things that if a person is healthy, and no guilt, no judgment for anyone that does or doesn't, you can do it every 56 days and they take about a liter. And generally speaking, adults have 5 to 6 liters. And they say, okay, you're going to feel queasy. Don't do any weightlifting. Don't do anything extraneous for a minimum of 24 hours. Like, you've got to just take it real easy, and you have to be healthy when you donate because your body needs every blood cell that it has when it's healthy or when it's sick. And when it's healthy, yeah, we've got an extra 20%. So let's give it away. But if you take more than that, you're not going to survive very well. And then if you take more than that and you're sick, your body has no ability to fight off the diseases, right? We talk about blood cells all the time and the white blood cell counts and red blood cells. And how do we think, we were just talking about the circulation system, right? The circulatory. How do you think all of those good your immune system actually gets to these infections? Through your bloodstream. And if you don't have a good flowing bloodstream, right, if this is August after a rough summer, it's not happening. Oh, yeah.
So I know that in modern medicine, they still do use leeches. There are medical leeches, and they're usually used to drain excess blood or pooling of blood and hematomas. Is that the thing? Because it's sanitary and it's easier. And if people are willing to have a leech on them for a while, then it's great. But historically, bloodletting's been around for a very long time.
Thousands and thousands of years.
It must have worked at least a little bit, or else they wouldn't have kept doing it, right?
But don't you think correlation and causation comes into play here? But people get better regardless of what we try to do to them. And so just because someone got better doesn't mean that what we did to them made them better.
Well, so there's an old remedy in which if you got bit by a snake, you would take a duck and put its butt on the wound and then cut its head off. And then while the butt is on the wound. And the thought was that it would suck out the poison.
The duck butt would suck out the poison.
Yes. Everyone knows this.
I just wanted to make that clear. I'm actually quite excited about that.
But that didn't stick.
Yeah.
But draining people of their blood, a painful procedure that is gross and makes me feel queasy thinking about, that stuck around for thousands of years. Is there any kind of medical benefit? Even obviously not in Washington's case, if you have an infection, don't get rid of your blood. But would that stimulate
placebo
antibodies to then go to the wound, or adrenaline to help boost the system? Are any of you familiar with any positives of bloodletting?
I'm not answering this question to describe physiological processes, but the placebo effect is extremely powerful. In just the study of medicine, contemporary researchers, there's some who have done a lot of really interesting work on placebo effects, and obviously we don't have the same kind of data to double blind study results of placebo effects for ancient practices, ancient cultures, but I think cross culturally, all human societies, we all do things that as Rachel said, we can't really tie a causation thread between those practices and healing in a definitive way. But a lot of what we do for cultural or, comfort reasons. And even that is different than placebo, which in a lot of cases, the placebo effect does actually change. It does lead to physiological changes. And it's kind of weird and mysterious, but I think that's not something to take for granted or underappreciate, because I think even like early psychological studies showing, if you're in a situation where you're around like comforting familiar people and a comforting familiar environment, you just fare better. Like, even if we're not talking about injury, you fare better in terms of your like mental health, mental well-being, which translates to sometimes like physical well-being. And that, those are things that are, I think, often considered like non-essential pieces of the healing process, but yet we all, like, there are studies to show that people care about a doctor's bedside manner. People care about having, chaplains come into hospital settings to support people, and that does facilitate something real in terms of healing. But it's just not, there's not like a clear, like hard scientific way of describing that necessarily. But that's not to say that it's like not important also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add that, you were just talking there, Kendra, about hospitals, but also previous to that, you were saying in places where people are surrounded and around things that they're comfortable with, the best healing happens when you're not in a hospital, right? A hospital is no place for a sick person. I mean, and I mean that. My dad, who's now a doctor, said that to me, and it's like, that makes perfect sense, because unless you're really sick and you can't be at home, being at home is your best chance of getting better. And I'm using that word intentionally, right? Getting closer to a cure and your sense of normal faster than being in a hospital. And the hospitals are there for the very, very sick people who cannot be at home for whatever reason. So that's one of those other reasons, like, stay away from a hospital. Also, they just have a lot of germs still. So stay away from a hospital. Unless, again, you have no other alternative. And so, to answer Zach's question there too, I think the idea of, so Zach, you were kind of recoiling from the ickiness of leeches. And I wonder, or the bloodletting perspective, I wonder if part of the causation and the correlation might be you're now treating a person differently. You're giving them advantages. Maybe you're giving them more soup. Maybe you're giving them more fluids. Maybe you're treating them differently because, it's so serious that we have to call a doctor in, or whoever, whatever their title was, whoever was giving the leeches, the priest perhaps, right? That now they're so different that their everydayness is being treated differently. You give them the extra blanket, you give them the soup, you take them outside, like whatever it is, that's really what's happening. And so, yes, the leeches are helping, but only as a secondary issue.
That reminds me of the correlation causation argument around the increased health of religious people. Right? We've heard that those numbers thrown around a lot, that people who regularly are connected to religious communities are healthier, live longer than people that don't.
Right.
Yeah.
And the argument from the religious perspective is that, well, faithful people have God, and God heals you, and prayer works. And so prayerful people are healthy people. When the opposite argument is then, the opposite argument is that, well, you're connected to a religious community. You've got people that care for you. You've got people that come by. There's comfort. There's connection. There's soup delivered to your door every day. And those intangibles are what cause the health and the healing.
Yeah,
Right.
and the direction of the correlation is not always clear if you're looking at like study results. So if you're healthy and able-bodied to like get to your church or synagogue or whatever, then you can do that. But you were already healthy from the starting point. Whereas if you're like chronically ill and unable to get out of bed, then maybe you don't go to a religious service because you're not able to. But the starting point, the kind of direction of behavior was influenced by the status of your health rather than like the status of your religiosity. And that whole like body of literature is like really, really vast. And it is really interesting, but it's a good good examples to bring up when we're talking about correlation.
Yeah. But Zach, you asked earlier about, why did bloodletting last for so long? I mean, there is, I just started remembering that there are certain chronic diseases, blood diseases that people will have, or blood cancers that will have, where it will produce too much either iron in their blood or too much red blood cells. And the way they do that, one of the treatments for that is a phlebotomy. And so, which is the removal of a specific amount of blood. It's more than just going in and doing a donation, for example. And so and that is done for medical purposes. Like my dad used to have to do that because of a blood disease that he had. And so, so I started very quickly looking at what is the difference between bloodletting and phlebotomy. And, some of this is just saying that bloodletting was a therapeutic practice that started in antiquity, but that there's still phlebotomy is another way of saying bloodletting. It's not
when you
controlled.
Go, it's phlebotomist.
Correct.
It's the person that takes
it's
your blood.
It's controlled now than it used to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Or at least we think it's controlled.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to be cautious about too, when we talk about older treatments, the cutting off the duck's head and how ridiculous it is, or how they used to use urine to whiten their teeth, stuff like that, where we can easily look back at those folksy, unintelligent people and say, my goodness, aren't we so intelligent today? We have science, and science has given us all the answers. And those of you who might be listening at home or have people in your lives who you've talked to about sorts of things will then, get kind of rightly upset at the sort of hubris of that there's medicine and then there's alternative medicine, and alternative medicine is based just on placebo and fantasies and dreams, and real medicine is based on science and truth. And I think modern medicine is wonderful, and it has given us so much more trust in the process and understanding the why of things work, but that a lot of what we have in modern medicine is based on traditional medicine. The ancient Egyptians knew that if you had pain or inflammation or fever, that you could chew on birch bark and it would reduce those things. And it wasn't until much later that that's how we got aspirin, I think of penicillin, just comes from mold. And how many of indigenous cultures will watch the way that nature interacts with itself and then will gain lessons from that, watching what this animal eats when they eat it, and then using that and applying that and finding that those things work. And only much later do we discover the scientific rationale for it. And we're seeing sort of a resurgence in the past couple of decades of people taking indigenous medicines seriously and looking for the whys of why these things have stuck around for so long, and lots of times discovering that there is wisdom behind these traditions. And the whole colonial Western mindset of it's our way or it's just fantasy is not all that helpful.
Thank you for that perspective. I think we do need to recognize our own bias, and also recognize, as we were sort of talking about with the tobacco industry, that there's a lot of push with marketing, and there's a lot of issues in those ways that we're all very susceptible to, that came out of this trusting of the scientific process. And just because it's old doesn't mean it is old and unscientific, doesn't mean that it's not also helpful. Right. So putting that caveat.
Also, sometimes they are awful and that we shouldn't do the old things. If you have syphilis at home, do not inject mercury into your urethra, because that does not work.
Right.
Despite the fact that Blackbeard did it. And
well, and I think too.
Yeah. Are there other? Oh, sorry, Ian.
Well,
sorry.
Just real quick, you talk about this, and I think this will be, what you're just discussing, Zach, and wanting to be respectful. One of the people I hope to get on the show sometime is David DeSteno, who wrote the book How God Works. And in this particular book, I mean, he is talking in some situations about healing, and says early on, I've not finished it yet, but, it says, I realized that the surprise of my colleagues and I felt when we saw evidence of religion's benefits was a sign of our hubris. Born of a common notion among scientists, all of religion was superstition and therefore could have little practical benefit. Yet as I learned, and as this book shows, spiritual leaders often understood in ways that we can now scientifically confirm how to help people live better lives. And so, and he is someone I really, and I'll reach out to him, see if we can get him on the show, because I think that's some interesting research he's done to show, what is it we're learning now, and how, it's applicable to helping others. But another one I wanted to bring up was the notion of maggot therapy.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah, which I've got a little bit here, but if you know more, and please, but, which I
no, say it. Rachel hates bugs.
Yeah, so here we go.
God.
So
I could do leeches all day long, but maggots.
I got this.
Don't talk about moths.
I got this great book called Strange Science. Wonderful book, right? All these cool things in here, but one of them is pages on maggot therapy, and it says it sounds like something from a horror film. Fat, cream-colored maggots eating their way through infected sores and wounds. It's not. It's medicine, Rachel. It even says Rachel right there.
It's science.
Since ancient times, doctors have used maggots to prevent wounds from getting infected. In the 1940s, antibiotics replaced maggots, but bacteria adapted and started to become resistant to antibiotics. And now we get the return of the maggots. Maggots work by secreting digestive enzymes that feed on dead tissue. Those enzymes also kill bacteria in a wound and speed up healing. Doctors will place between 200 and 300 maggots on a wound, then cover it, maggots and all, with mesh. Beneath the mesh, the maggots feed for 48 to 72 hours. When they're done, the doctors remove them. Wounds that haven't healed for months, even years, often respond quickly to maggot medicine. And I really am hopeful. This is a video clip we need to share of the wonderful reactions we're seeing from both Rachel and Kendra.
I'm just going to be real public about this. If I am ever in a situation where I do not have a wound that heals and the only thing that could cure me is maggot therapy, just put me out of my misery.
Good knowing you.
Just don't even bother.
I feel like Zach is like, sign me up.
Pull the plug. And I'm like, kill the maggots. Like, don't even, just, I'll amputate. Or I respect people that go through that so much. I'm not one of them. I say that never having that issue.
You can put the maggots on me, but then also punch me in the face and knock me out.
All right, so I'll be dead and Kendra will be unconscious.
Yeah.
And Zal could be loving every minute.
I love bugs. Sorry.
Yeah.
All right, Ian, where do you fall in this spectrum?
They're highly nutritious too. After they're done
you're just gonna
eating
eat them?
you,
Yeah,
you can just kill them and dry them and then eat them, and then you get all your protein.
After they've eaten all of your rotting flesh. It's just like a nice little cycle.
And then you get
just
the nutrients back.
Well, should you cook them
It's the
first?
circle of life.
Well, Zach, would you want to
Not
cook
in your
them
own
first?
body.
Because they ate your eating
the way
your
you do
dead flesh?
with insects. You take the insects, you suffocate them in a box with carbon dioxide so you don't squish them or anything.
Mean.
Then you take them out and you dehydrate them, and then you crush them into a powder and add that into your food. That's the best way to do it.
Did by any chance any of you all see, since we're talking about maggots,
Can we continue for the rest of the episode?
we not?
See how long Rachel makes it.
yes, that's another video clip that needs to be shared of Rachel doing the gagging reflex each time I talk about maggots. She's like, whoa.
I feel bad for Rachel.
Like, I'm not queasy, but maggots, oh God,
Well, so let's get into another discussion then. Kellogg's Cornflakes. Now, I'd found a very little bit of
good
information.
transition away from bugs.
Dear listener,
Cereal steps.
Now that's a segue.
Hello, dear listener. So when I mentioned Kellogg's Cornflakes prior to recording, both Rachel and Kendra perked up and seemed to know more information about this than I did. And so I will at least share the very little bit of information I have. But please, Rachel and Kendra, jump in and tell us what you know about Kellogg's Cornflakes, but from what I have read, is that J.H. Kellogg, one of the people who developed Kellogg's Cornflakes, he was a medical doctor and health activist, and he created the cornflakes. He was one of the people who created it, and he hoped that they would prevent sexual urges, or more specifically, to inhibit the urge to masturbate. And so, Rachel, Kendra, you reacted earlier. What did you know? Because this took me by complete surprise. Because it didn't work. So
I was going to say, Rachel, you go, because I have to go. It's like noon. I don't really have that much to add either. I know that is a thing that happened.
Do we not want to then talk about the very last one about hysteria before Kendra leaves?
We can keep talking about it, but I think she's got to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to leave in like 30 seconds.
Anything fun you want to tell us about hysteria, Kendra?
Wow. Don't eat cornflakes. Just stick with Cheerios. Cheerios make you horny, so that's
start
according
your day with
to science.
Nice,
apparently,
cold bowl of cereal if you want to feel nothing.
Not just cereal.
If you want to feel nothing at all,
bland cereal for a bland sex life. That's the moral of the story. All right, see you later.
Bye, Kendra.
Cool.
Enjoy your cereal.
So what kind of like sexy breakfast was he trying to?
I don't really understand this
then?
one. Rachel, can you help us out?
So I think I'm in the same boat of it was a factoid that I very much knew and held on to. But beyond that, I don't have a whole lot of information. I mean, the idea is, everyone has breakfast. And so to prevent those urges in the morning, and also let's just clarify something here. When they say masturbation, they really mean men.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I left that part out.
Nobody.
Male. Yeah.
Right. And so basically throughout time, and this was a religious issue. And so it wasn't a doctor issue. It was a religious issue of male masturbation is against God, going all the way back to some Genesis of don't spill your seed and Leviticus and stuff like that. But it's a bad idea to spill your seed. And that got translated into don't masturbate. And so it was a religious idea. And if you look at men, generally speaking, I think we were talking about this maybe a couple weeks ago too. In the morning, men generally have more of, I don't even know how to say this, erect penises based on what was going on in the evenings, in the dreams, and their inability to regulate their own erections. And so if that's the first thing that you do in the morning to stop that, have cold, dry cereal.
Well,
something that's bland.
And I will...
Let's also say Kellogg, as a human, Mr. Kellogg himself, was a bit of an anti-sex fanatic.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good way to phrase it.
The man was married and still never had sex, and wrote books about how he and his wife never had sex, and they lived in separate bedrooms, and they adopted their children, and that sex pollutes the body, and it's the worst thing in the world. And so, like, this guy was afraid of his body.
Right. And again,
did not want
he did this in
anyone else's body.
Yeah, and he did this in a religious context. He didn't do it just because he was asexual and thought everyone else should be too.
Yeah.
Not asexual, anti-sexual.
So I will say this, and so I did look it up, and so, this is, now I'm getting this from Snopes, and there could be good or bad things getting things from Snopes. But according to Snopes.com, so the claim is that Kellogg's cornflakes were originally created in an effort to discourage American consumers from masturbating. And as you said, Rachel, it's male. Actually, so it should say that. The rating is mostly false. And so they're saying what is true is that the creation of cornflakes was part of J.H. Kellogg's broader advocacy for a plain, bland diet. Without referring to cornflakes in particular, Kellogg elsewhere recommended a plain, bland diet as one of several methods to discourage masturbation. So I guess that was people just put that together.
Can I just read a little quote from one of his books?
Yeah, please do.
By the way. He talks about onanism, which Rachel alluded to, is a story of Onan from where in Scripture are we? That is where he's supposed to consummate this.
So this is the story of this is in Genesis in Judah.
Genesis, yeah.
Yeah, this is with Judah. And yeah.
Where he's supposed to impregnate his brother's widow and then spills his seed on the ground.
Because he doesn't want to, because he wants the child to be his own and not be his dead brother's wife's son. And therefore all the dead brother's property goes to him, and he doesn't then have a son. So instead of doing that, he's just like, nope.
So then God knocks him out.
Right.
So he talks about onanism. So when he talks about onanism, he's talking about masturbation.
Yeah.
He says, neither plague nor war nor smallpox have produced results so disastrous to humanity as the pernicious habit of onanism. Such a victim dies literally by his own hand.
Yeah.
Such a victim dies literally by his own hand.
Literally.
He must have been so happy with that line. Can you imagine him writing that out? And he's like, oh, this is a killer. This is good. This is good. This is good. He dies by his own hand. Oh, I got to show this to someone.
Yeah. Also, let's just add to who this person was. He spent 30 years of his life dedicated to promoting eugenics.
Yes, he did.
So
Near the end of his life.
whether or not there was the direct cornflakes is for masturbation, it was promoted by a person who was anti-sexual and pro-eugenic. So donate, that's the history of cornflakes.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, recent research has found that for most people, sex is actually super healthy for a person's continued health and well-being, mentally, physically, emotionally, releases all kinds of amazing hormones and good things into your body. And a lot of religions throughout history have recognized that, have seen
Judaism.
Spiritual ecstasy, orgasm is spiritual ecstasy. That's the moment of connection to the divine, this breaking forth between the natural and the supernatural, and this thin place in spirituality. Have celebrated that. And I think we're coming back around to that. That's a good thing.
Right.
Christianity is still lagging far, far, far behind. Thank you, some combination of Plato and Augustine, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
Maybe it's kind of like plumbing, right? They had it in ancient Egypt, and then it took
I was wondering
3,000 years to come back.
Yeah.
So
I was wondering where you were going with plumbing.
Not quite that one.
Yeah.
But no, my Jewish comment was that Judaism sees. And by Judaism, big broad stroke brush using right here, normative, ancient orthodoxy style Judaism saw sex only within a marital heterosexual concept. But inside those boundaries, more of it. Also, it's a double mitzvah. It's a doubly good thing to do on Shabbat, the day that we're supposed to be the highest connected to God. And this was one of the ways to be even more connected to the divine, was through sex with your spouse. And I was thinking, as you were talking about Kellogg too, how they didn't have sex even though they were married. One of the things in an ancient ketubah, a marriage document given to the wife, was right, and that if the husband doesn't fulfill his side of the contract because he doesn't, or he's dead, then she gets X, Y, and Z things, 50 chickens, a sheep, or whatever. It depends how much she's worth. Old divorcees are worth nothing. But beyond that, one of the stipulations in there is how often they have to have sex, how often the husband must provide sex to his wife, not the other way around. And it listed how frequent. So a day trader was once a week at a minimum, right? But a merchant every 3 to they had A donkey driver, that was once a month. And then a camel driver was once every 3 months, because they recognize that if you're a camel driver, you're gone for a very long time. So don't punish them. And then they had because these are scholars writing this, and I don't know what their problem was. They just want to have sex with each other instead of their wives. They said, every 7 years is all
every
you have
7 years.
Yeah. It was ridiculous how often or how not often they had to have sex, so that they could go to their rabbi's house and study with him for years on end, and then just come back once every few years, have sex with the wife, and then go again. So having sex in the religious concept, again, in that very narrow first understanding of cis heterosexual marriages, has kind of made sex positive in Judaism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
there's that.
I know, because we are approaching the hour, but I do want to, at least because we talked about it before recording. It's a chance for me to get all my giggles out around this idea of hysteria.
Yes.
Even more of your giggles out.
Yeah, most of my giggles. But this was something that I do remember hearing about, at one point about female hysteria. And there's different articles, that I've found that talk about, because even there were films about it, or there was a film about it, a play. And so the idea was that, and thankfully, I'm going to keep fumbling this, but Rachel introduced us to a really cool person. I wanted to shout out for SciBabe on Facebook. Does some really interesting stuff. I'm, really excited about reading more about her. But what's interesting is that the argument is that, hold on, let me pull my thing up. It'll just be easier. It was believed, or this is the argument, that in the Victorian era, doctors treated women diagnosed with hysteria, which is no longer a diagnosis, by the way, by genital stimulation to induce an orgasm. This hysteria was supposed to be a buildup of fluid in the woman's womb, and doctors assumed that since men ejaculated and felt better, that it stood to reason this would work for women. Apparently, there was multiple, ideas of what was it that the different symptoms that people would have, obviously, if they were experiencing hysteria. And so this is the way to go, was this manual massage. But a text came out in 1999 and I believed it till I started doing more research for this episode. A historian wrote this book that came out in 1999. And in that, she argued that this was the reason why the vibrator was invented, was to make it so that it was easier for the doctors having to treat women for hysteria. I'm just saying it all nice, but so yeah, and found out that actually is not accurate. A more recent paper from the last couple of years has come out showing that this is actually inaccurate, that there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that that women were treated for hysteria by doctors bringing them to orgasm in their offices. So, or that this was the reason why vibrators were invented. But again, a medical treatment that was something that took off based on one historian's perspective and or book, and then others kind of push back on it. What's fascinating, we can share these in show notes or something, but in reading about this particular ailment and this supposed treatment. Yes. And supposed treatment, it was interesting to read about how this particular historian of technology kind of has backpedaled a little bit and has said, well, no, I didn't mean, I meant it more as a hypothesis, not a, yes, this is the way it was. But then, when you actually look at the writing, it shows that that's not actually how it was presented in the text itself, but it still took off, right? Because it was, I mean, when you think about it, it sounds kind of funny. And so it took off.
Yeah.
People listened to it and.
Right. Because also, God forbid somebody create something for women's pleasure simply for women's pleasure.
Right. And that's actually this.
For no other
this article
reason.
From the Atlantic says that at the very beginning. It's a disturbing insight implying that vibrators succeeded not because they advanced female pleasure, but because they saved labor for male physicians.
Right. So again, something simply for women that has nothing to do with a man gets co-opted into a story of, oh, those poor men. So just
poor doctors.
Poor doctors.
Yeah.
Or in a really awful way of the abuse, the potential abuse of doctors taking advantage of their women patients and showing that it's okay. None of this is ever okay.
But even there, I mean, you could easily go online and find
what are you trying to find there? Yeah.
Articles to support that this.
Be careful
this is
what
accurate,
you Google.
That it was used for this as recent as 2019.
Right.
Right.
So know your sources.
Correct.
Use some good thinking. And if you're going to Google things, feel free to use private browsing.
Yes.
And if you're into the scientific method, and you're feeling a little hysterical, maybe you just want to try it out.
Yeah.
See if it works for you.
And that's our message to you.
Enjoy
just
your
document
orgasm.
your hypothesis. There you go.
Rachel.
Science is just messing around and taking notes, right? So
That's right. Take some notes. Wash your hands first.
Yeah.
And
after. Okay, that's all I got.
thank you, Doctor.
Yeah.
Doctor.